Despite the fact that Ace Attorney is a murder mystery solving visual novel series, answering the actual question of who done it is often not as difficult as someone looking in from the outside may initially believe. The fact of the matter is that more often than not, the identity of the culprit in any given case is usually either plainly obvious or easily deduced through the process of elimination. And that's because the process of trying to nail down that culprit in the courtroom and prove how exactly they committed the crime is usually where the real mystery lies throughout the series. This is especially true for veterans of the Ace Attorney series, who are usually able to take one good look at a character and go, yep, that's the guy. He did something bad. And that's exactly why I find those rare times where Ace Attorney actually does go out of its way to conceal the identity of the true culprit, keep them in the shadows to build up suspense, and make the reveal of their identity the most critical point in the game, to be so fascinating. It hasn't happened that often, but when it does, it puts a new spin on the typical formula and really shakes things up, whether it's for better or for worse. In this video, I've managed to isolate 3 separate Ace Attorney games where I feel that the identity of the game's final villain is the focal point of that game's finale. And I'm going to go through them one by one and break them down in order to dissect what makes a good twist villain, what makes a bad twist villain, and what makes a legendary twist villain. Let's get started. Apollo Justice Ace Attorney is a very experimental game. It really goes out of its way to be bold and try new things that the series had not tackled before, which naturally led to the game's incredibly mixed reception. And no character better exemplifies this experimentation than the game's premier twist villain, Christoph Gavin. When players are first introduced to Christoph in the first case of the game, he assumes the role of Apollo's mentor, taking the place that Mia Fey took for Phoenix Wright in the original trilogy. In his initial exchange with Apollo, players learn 2 important facts. Christoph is a friend of the defendant, Phoenix Wright, and he dined with Phoenix on the night of the murder. Unlike Mia, Christoph does initially come off as slightly cold and intimidating to the player, but it's overall nothing too noteworthy. And it's practically impossible to notice when there's so much going on in the case itself. Phoenix Wright has been accused of killing a mysterious man by the name of Shady Smith after losing a game of cards to him at the Borscht Bowl Club. He's a different man after losing his attorney's badge 7 years ago, but it's still clear that he knows more than he's letting on. As the trial ensues, clues begin to point towards Olga Orly, the woman who dealt out the cards for Phoenix and Shady's fateful game. Christoph strongly encourages Apollo to prove her guilt, and even lends in his own assistance when necessary. However, just as it seems like the case is closed, Phoenix Wright objects and offers up the possibility of a third suspect besides himself and Orly. Phoenix explains that there were 2 decks of cards found at the scene, one with red backs and one with blue. The cards used in his game with Shady Smith were the ones with the red backs, so only someone who was there at the crime scene on that night could have known that there was another deck with blue backs. With this in mind, players are asked to identify who this mysterious third suspect is. And due to the very limited number of options, there's really only one answer whether they remember the 2 throwaway lines of dialogue where this was mentioned or not. Yes, it's Christoph Gavin. Now on paper, this is an incredible twist. I mean, the protagonist's own mentor being the true culprit is an insane twist. But there's one big issue. Well, actually, there's a lot of issues, but we're only talking about one for this video. I'm going off script with this one. There's a lot of big problems with this, actually, but we're just going to talk about one thing. This twist happens a couple hours into the game. The fact of the matter is that players barely know anything about the type of person that Christoph is before he's labeled as the true culprit of the case. And as such, they're not really given a reason to care about this twist. Had players gotten to know Christoph prior to this reveal, it could have been earth-shattering. But as it is, it really doesn't have any impact whatsoever. Instead of making players say, it couldn't be him, could it? It instead makes them say, oh, it's him. Okay. To make things worse, the characters connected to Christoph, namely Apollo and Christoph's younger brother Clavier, who's introduced in the next case, don't care either. You would think that their connection to Christoph would be a defining part of their rivalry as a defense attorney and prosecutor, but no, it's not even mentioned a single time. Apart from one single flashback when Apollo first meets Clavier and an incredibly random Christoph impression from Emma Skye, seriously, what was up with that? Apollo and Clavier seem entirely unaffected by the news that Christoph murdered somebody. And if they don't care, then why should the player? This brings me to the first major element of a good twist villain that I feel Christoph Gavin fails to embody: care. In order for a twist villain to truly leave an impact on the player needs to have some sort of connection to that character that makes it hard to believe that the twist in question could even be true in the first place. If it's just some random guy, then players will have no trouble believing he's the culprit no matter how out of left field the reveal itself actually is, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. Christoph Gavin is one of the most unexpected twist villains in the series, especially for a first case. But because the reveal happens so early, it ultimately doesn't matter. The game then tries to salvage this by trying to build a mystery around his motive for killing Shady Smith, going as far as to make him the centerpiece of the final case and even showing him in the case's intro. But unfortunately, the game frequently opts to tell the player about the type of man Christoph is during the final case rather than show them, which anyone with the least bit of knowledge in storytelling would tell you is a big no-no. Players are told all about how Phoenix always suspected him from the start, how other characters were able to see the darkness within him, and how that darkness was locked behind a set of black cyclocks. But that side of him is the only side of him that players know. And the apparent facade that he was able to hold on to for so many years is something that players only get to see for an hour or two at the beginning of the game. The game wants players to believe that he's this deranged, manipulative psychopath. But it all feels artificial and unearned because they never really learn why he is the way that he is. The game specifies that he was simply always this way, which makes him a very difficult character to understand and a very difficult character to care about. And it doesn't help that he's already in solitary confinement during this case, so the stakes are practically non-existent. This creates a situation where it feels like the game really wants you to care about what's going on, but the main characters still barely do, and the player likely doesn't either. Christoph Gavin had all the pieces necessary to be one of the most legendary twist villains in the series. But due to the poor execution of those pieces and an immense lack of character development needed to get players to care, it missed the mark by a country mile. Thankfully, Capcom learned from the mistakes they made in Apollo Justice when transitioning into the next game, Dual Destinies, and its twist villain, Bobby Fulbright. When players first meet Bobby Fulbright, he's introduced as the main detective of Dual Destinies, taking the place that Gumshoe and Emma took in the past. He's presented as a silly, lovable goofball who isn't always the most cooperative, but always means well in the end. He's ridiculously over the top, doing things like shoving his badge into people's faces, I would never, and yelling his signature line, "In Justice We Trust." He has all the pieces of a fan-favorite character, and for the first two cases, as well as the game's DLC case, he stays that way. In fact, I'd argue that several important plot points in those cases wouldn't have been possible were it not for Fulbright stepping in the name of justice. He goofs up sometimes, but he's truly trying his best, and that's genuinely endearing. Come Case 4, where a man by the name of Solomon Starbuck is accused of murdering his co-pilot Clay Terran in the Cosmos Space Center, Fulbright begins to act noticeably different. Phoenix Wright and Athena Sykes, two of the three protagonists of this game, note how Fulbright is a lot more cooperative than he usually is. And after breaking through some Cyclocks, Fulbright explains that he's acting strangely because he's worried about his boss, Prosecutor Simon Blackwell. More specifically, he's worried about the return of the Phantom, a mysterious figure that may not only be responsible for the current case, but a case 7 years ago that Blackwell has a personal connection to. As the following trial nearly reaches its conclusion, Fulbright swoops in to save the day by presenting a decisive piece of evidence: a lighter with the victim's blood on it and fingerprints that supposedly belong to the true culprit. This does manage to prove Starbuck's innocence, but unfortunately ends up incriminating the one whose fingerprints are actually on the lighter, Athena Sykes, which is a fact that Fulbright overlooked in his hurry to present this evidence to the court as soon as possible. Now, despite the fact that I just pointed out all of these facts to you, I really want to emphasize how simple it is to write them off during a first playthrough. In fact, I'd argue it's borderline impossible not to. Fulbright is assisting Phoenix and crew more than usual because he's worried about Blackwell? Checks out. Fulbright tries to help them win the case, but ends up not realizing whose fingerprints are on the lighter, which puts Athena in a pickle? Definitely sounds like him. All of these genuine hints towards what's to come make perfect sense. almost too much sense. But we'll get back to that soon. As the game transitions into Case 5, where Phoenix must defend Athena in court, heavy emphasis is placed on the mysterious entity that Fulbright initially mentioned in the previous case, the Phantom. The only information that Phoenix and crew are able to initially gather about this mysterious spy is that he's able to control his emotions, allowing him to feel anything or nothing at will. In court, Phoenix is able to deduce that Clay Tarrant's true killer had to have made his escape by leaping from the Space Center's corridor while it was rotating in order to land on a nearby emergency ladder and make his escape undetected. He then deduces that only someone with little to no emotion would have been able to make such a death-defying leap with no fear. Furthermore, that person would have had to have known that that emergency ladder was going to be there in the first place due to the very narrow time frame that they would have had to make the jump. That lack of emotion aspect to things allows Phoenix to connect the emotionless Phantom to the case and conclude that he must be the true culprit. As for that second point regarding the emergency ladder, everyone in the courtroom is stumped. That is, until Phoenix recalls one particular line from Aura Blackwell, who ended up lowering the emergency ladder in the first place. So I lowered my emergency ladder like the detective leading the evacuation told me to. Upon realizing the truth at this moment, I remember freezing. Silence enveloped the room, and I could hardly believe what I was reading. After several cases of Bobby Fulbright doing his best to help Phoenix and crew, after so many laughs, after so many triumphs thanks to him, he was the Phantom. And he always was. The shock doesn't stop there, though, as it's soon revealed that Bobby Fulbright had in actuality been mutilated beyond recognition over a year ago before the events of this game. And the man the player knew was merely an impersonator who stole his identity and his life. The Bobby Fulbright that players thought they knew was not just a mere manipulator, but a Phantom assuming the role of a man they never truly knew. A Phantom who felt no joy, no sadness, no anger, and no surprise. A creature masquerading as a fan favorite character. Bobby Fulbright is the exact type of twist villain that Apollo Justice failed to create. He fooled the player with a lovable personality in order to create a bone-chilling twist that is still hard to believe to this day. He's the strongest embodiment of the care factor that I talked about in the entire series, and I don't see that title being taken from him anytime soon. In fact, it's almost too far in that direction. Prior to this reveal, Bobby Fulbright truly felt like a real character with real relationships and real development. It makes for a profoundly strong twist to reveal that it was all a facade, but it also almost feels like a waste to just throw that all away. Had this not been the case, I would have loved to see Fulbright in future Ace Attorney games. But because he's the Phantom, he has no chance of ever returning. And just as this twist feels like it's almost too much of a loss, it also feels far too out of left field to make any real sense in the moment. While Fulbright displays a very strong utilization of the care factor, he's sorely lacking in clues. Like I explained earlier, the moments foreshadowing this reveal felt so normal for the character that the player likely won't even think back to them after the reveal itself. I personally had no moment of reconsidering everything I knew about the guy to connect the dots and realize how it all makes sense. It felt more like I had to pay close attention to him solely from that point onward. And everything leading up to this reveal was more or less irrelevant. Even the very line used to reveal his true identity is repeated 3 times in a row, because I think even the devs knew that it would be hard to pick up on. While I do understand the difficulty of creating subtle clues without giving too much away, I think Fulbright was almost too good at keeping his true identity hidden. Which sounds like a strange complaint given the fact that he's a trained international spy, but it does make the game's storytelling slightly weaker. Despite all of that though, I do love the Phantom. The concept of a villain who feels no fear and has worn so many masks that he doesn't even recognize himself anymore is as unnerving as it is compelling. And it all leads to what is easily my favorite breakdown in the entire series. He's not perfect, but for the creativity of his concept and the masterful use of the care concept, he'll always be an S-tier character for me personally. So So we've gone over a twist villain that was sorely lacking in the care department, and a twist villain that utilized care very well, but could have used some work in the way its clues were conveyed. So what happens when a twist villain manages to strike a healthy balance between these two factors, while also embodying a whole new factor to call its own? Well, you get the mastermind of Ace Attorney Investigations 2, Simeon Saint. Now, what immediately makes Simeon different from the previous two twist villains in this video is that he's not introduced as one of the game's main characters. Instead, Simeon acts as the main suspect during the second case of the game, and it's up to the protagonist, in this case Miles Edgeworth, to prove his innocence. And due to this admittedly minor role in the grand scheme of things, Simeon Saint comes off as not all too complex. He's a timid, scaredy cat who's prone to shaking, stuttering, and occasionally fainting, but he's really not much more than that. This makes Simeon what I would like to call a gimmick character. And by gimmick character, I mean a character that typically only has one or two notable things about him, and that's about it. However, I'd be lying if I said there was nothing at all to say about Simeon. For one, he's an animal tamer at the Very Big Circus and the new partner of Money the Monkey, who likes to use his hair like joysticks Ratatouille style. And two, the victim in this case and the culprit of the previous case, Bronco Knight, was actually a childhood friend of his. To quote him directly, "I've known him since we were kids, when both of us were all alone. He doesn't have any family, you see, just like me." And that's all there really is to say about him in this case. He's used as a main motivator for Edgeworth because he wants to prove his innocence like any defense attorney would. But that makes Simeon more of a plot device more than anything else, seeing as the two don't really hold a strong connection outside of that purpose. In the end, the case comes to a close and players are given a wholesome ending where Simeon invites Edgeworth to Very Big Circus's next show. And as with all one-note characters like Simeon, players likely expected this to be the last they ever saw of him. And for the next two cases, he is unsurprisingly nowhere to be found. But I wouldn't be talking about him in this video if things ended there. When Case 5 finally rolls around, Simeon makes his reappearance, which ends up not being as surprising as one may think. Seeing as the first half of the case deals with handling the trial of the case Simeon was involved in, it's not all too surprising that he'd want to stop by just to make sure he doesn't get arrested again. Furthermore, the final case in this game is different from every other case in the series because it manages to bring in puzzle pieces from every previous case in the game, which also means that almost every character throughout the game is present here. That's because throughout this whole game, there has been a looming figure, a mastermind lurking in the shadows and pulling the strings from behind the scenes. Every single case connects to him in some way. And while he was not directly involved in the murders in those cases, none of them would have occurred had he not initiated them. All except for the third case due to it taking place 18 whole years ago. But don't worry, we'll get to how that ties in very soon. Finding the identity of this mastermind is of particular importance to Edgeworth because he's able to deduce that he's likely the culprit in this final case as well. For these reasons, Simeon's limited screen time during the first half is not only unsurprising, but entirely unnoteworthy upon first glance. He's doing his best to help out like everyone else, but he doesn't really stand out at all, especially when the real focus is on the mastermind behind it all. As Edgeworth and his very large entourage of companions debate over who this mastermind could possibly be, the blind incarcerated assassin from the second case, Bodhidharma Canis, makes his reappearance. As it turns out, Canis escaped from prison because he's in search of the same mastermind that Edgeworth is, though not for the same reasons. He wants to find this mysterious figure because he once saved his life 12 years ago. Canis then regales a long and convoluted tale intertwining every single past case in order to explain how he came to meet this mastermind when he was just a young pup. To summarize, it all started 18 years ago, when Canis encountered two young boys freezing to death in a car following the events of the game's third case. Canis decided to save these two young boys, then 6 years later, one of them would end up saving his life during their fateful reunion. Through some clever use of evidence, Edgeworth is able to deduce that one of these young boys that Canis found was a young Bronco Knight. Though Knight can't be the mastermind that Canis is looking for because he was murdered in the second case, which was the last time he was relevant up until now. With all this in mind, there's still one more child to consider. A child with connections to Bronco Knight that ended up saving Bodhidharma Canis 12 years ago. It can seem fairly obvious to you because of the way that I'm describing it, but let me tell you, nothing could have prepared me for the lines of dialogue that appeared on screen next. I've known him since we were kids. when we were all alone. He doesn't have family, you see, just like me. Simeon Saint. A character that's so effortlessly faded into the background. A character who is specifically written in a way that would make players write him off as a one-note gimmick character. A character that no one in a million years could have ever believed could hurt a fly. Was the mastermind behind everything from start to finish. And Edgeworth was just another pawn in his elaborate game. No, I mean, it couldn't be true, right? Ace Attorney's never done anything like this before. There's no way that something so elaborate, so genius, could seriously all point to this bumbling buffoon from 3 cases ago. Capcom, you absolute geniuses. This twist is perfect for so many different reasons. It's a perfect blend of creating a twist villain that the player genuinely cares about, while also carefully utilizing clues pointing towards his true self that come together to create a twist that truly blows the player's mind. From a care perspective, it's not as extreme as Dual Destiny's twist villain, but the player still has enough of a connection to Simeon that it still feels like they were betrayed. The problem with Dual Destiny's twist villain is that it felt like the player lost something that they may or may not have genuinely loved. But here, I'd argue that this twist is a solely good development for Simeon's character. Rather than feel destructive to who he used to be, this twist feels like it takes Simeon from a simple and unnoteworthy character to a fascinating and complex character easily deserving a place among Ace Attorney's best. His deception was specifically made to create a twist that will shatter the player's mind without sacrificing anything in return. And this brings me to the second factor that I discussed in this video, clues, and the third and final factor, comprehensiveness. I find it highly unlikely that many players saw this legendary reveal coming. Yet the very second that it happens, everything from throughout the game starts to fall into place. And that's because thanks to Investigation 2's masterful storytelling, the player is able to realize and understand how this one man connects to every event in the game. Just to name an example, Simeon being the mastermind perfectly explains how he was able to help Edgeworth deduce where the mastermind had taken and kidnapped Sean Fenn. It wasn't because he just so happened to be in the area, it's because he was the mastermind. Or how he didn't directly kill Knight as he was suspected to in the second case, but he did cause it to happen through careful planning. Meaning that the police who initially accused him of the crime were kinda spot on. Moments like these are littered all over the place, and what's amazing is that they all fly completely under the player's radar at first, yet they all make perfect sense in retrospect. And I want to really take a step back so that I don't undermine just how great of an accomplishment that is. Creating a twist villain that is practically impossible to predict while also making the player feel stupid for not thinking of it sooner is incredibly hard to do. Which is why I was willing to cut Dual Destinies some slack. But here, it's done masterfully. This twist even makes the player start to rethink some simple things, such as the fact that Simeon is an animal tamer, which is a profession that involves training animals to follow one's commands. This was all likely foreshadowing to the fact that he bent others to his will without them knowing, in the same way that he would do to circus animals. Or the fact that his name is Simeon Saint, which, besides the obvious monkey and saint pun, is no doubt a reference to the game Simon Says, a game that involves making others do what Simon, or Simeon, tells them to do. It's one thing to create a good twist villain within the confines of a single case, but to go above and beyond and create a twist villain that makes the player rethink the entire game is not something that's often seen in the Ace Attorney series. It takes an immense amount of foresight and knowledge of the game's story, yet Capcom couldn't have pulled it off any better. Simeon Saint is not just pure shock value, and he's not just a display of clever clues hidden throughout a case. He's a comprehensive twist villain that embodies what it means to take murder mystery storytelling to its absolute limits. Hey, thanks for watching the video. Be sure to let me know who your favorite Ace Attorney twist villain is down in the comments below. And while you're down there, consider hitting the subscribe button for more deep dives into all things Ace Attorney. For now, though, that's all from me. Take care of yourselves.